If you've been watching the channel, you know I have this 2014 Honda Accord LX, and since I've had it, you guys have seen me do a bunch of different things to it, obviously with exterior changes and performance changes, and actually the most recent stuff has been performance oriented stuff. So today I'm actually switching it up, and we're going to be doing something with the interior, and that's right, we're going to be changing this very base head unit. Now, since this is an LX, this has just a single screen that's up there, and over here is the radio itself with the controls. I've always wanted to swap this out with a actual screen unit. I didn't want to go with the stock one because I know the stock one has some issues. I've seen quite a lot of people post online that the stock one has issues, and so I wanted to try to get something aftermarket. Now, with a lot of the aftermarket stuff, you do have to get this trim piece separate, and then of course the radio would go in the middle there. You can't just take this out, keep the stock trim piece, and put a different radio in there. So it has to be a separate trim piece that you get, and then you also have to get a wiring harness, specifically one that has like a module that will let you somewhat utilize the head unit or the screen that's up top like you do from factory. None of them, from what I can tell, can fully let you utilize it from factory once you remove the stock head unit, but some will let you keep some of the features that you have. So in today's video, we're actually going to go with a head unit that was sent to me by a company. And I do want to mention right now, before we get into the rest of the video, the head unit was supplied to me, but the company is very much aware that I'm going to be fully honest about it. And this is not paid, and they didn't give me any money on top of this or anything like that. They just sent me the head unit because they want me to make a video on it. And I explained to them I'm going to be honest about it, and if they're okay with that, then they can go ahead and send me the head unit. And actually, their response was they're very happy to hear that I will be honest with it. So that being said, let's get to looking at what head unit I went with. And the head unit that I went with is the Dasaita G13. I'm not sure if I said that correctly, but it is a bezel screen wiring kit all in one. Basically, when you go aftermarket screens on this, you have to find the right wiring kit, and then of course the bezel that you're going to use with the new screen. Where with this system, you do get everything all in one package, which is fantastic. It saves you time from having to find everything separately. You get all the wiring harness you need to connect to the stock wiring harness in your car, to USB ports, microphone, multiple different antennas from Wi-Fi to GPS to SIM card adapter, and of course a radio antenna. Now, before starting to mess with any electronics in the car, I make sure I disconnect the battery. Once that's disconnected, go inside and I start taking apart the trim that is near the emergency brake / shifter or center console. Removing this trim was fairly simple. All I had to do was focus on using trim tools towards the back by the armrest and just prying up on the edge of the trim itself. And once I got a little bit up, it was easy to just pop it up from the clips that are holding it in. And of course, I did the same on the other side. Some people are able to use their hands, but I prefer the trim tools. It made it a lot easier. Once that trim is removed, I removed the 2 screws holding in the small compartment or little pocket, whatever you want to call it, to gain access to the first set of bolts that hold the radio into the dash, the factory radio into the dash. To remove those 2 bolts, I use an automatic ratchet with a 10mm socket and extension. I use my phone with the front camera as a mirror to basically see where exactly those screws are so I can easily get to them without having to try to hunt for them blindly. I could have also used one of those small mirrors that I have that I use for mechanic work, but my phone was readily available, so I decided to do that. Once those bolts were removed, I focused on the top cover that sits above the radio in front of the factory screen. Since I have a tag form mount here, I adjusted it so that way it was a little easier to get into the cracks of this cover. I used used trim tools or trim pry bars to help lift up one side so I could unclip the cover from where it sits to gain access to the next set of screws. Once I remove that cover, I have access to the final 2 Phillips screws to remove that holds the factory radio into the dash. After I remove those, I focus on the side trim that's on the driver's side to pop it up just a little bit so it's not in the way when removing the stock radio out of the dash. I didn't have to fully remove it. I just left it there and just make sure it was popped out so it wasn't in the way. Once that was out of the way, then I just gently was pulling on the radio to pull it out from where it sits. Originally, I thought the climate control was going to come with it, but then I realized that the radio was actually clipped into the climate control with just some retaining clips that could allow it to pop out when swapping it out or needing to take it out. Obviously, once it was popped out, then I focused on unplugging the hazard switch. After unplugging the hazard switch, I focused on the back of the radio. Most of the plugs came out pretty easily. There was just one plug that gave me a little bit of a tough time. That's because it's very specific on how you remove it. There's a white tab that you have to move outwards from it, basically like a lever, and you just pull that upwards, and then once that's done, then you can unplug it from the radio. And then of course, once it was unplugged, it was time to transfer some of the stock stuff that's attached to this stock bezel over to the new radio / bezel. And those items, of course, are the hazard switch along with the vents themselves. To remove the vents, you simply have to undo 2 screws. And then once those 2 screws are undone, then there is just a few clips that hold the vents to the actual bezel itself that you just want to use a screwdriver or trim tools to release those clips to allow you to take the vents out. Once I got the vents out, I focused on doing the retaining clips that sit on the studs for the trim that allows it to lock into the dashboard. These little white retaining clips are a little bit of a annoyance to take off. Obviously, I wanted to be careful because one, I didn't want to break any, and that way this whole thing gets put on hold because I have to either order new ones or go to a dealership. And so I originally started using just a single trim tool along with my finger, the trim tool from the top, finger from the bottom. And this was working a little bit, but not as easily. So then I switched over to using 2 small screwdrivers to allow them to pop out. Once this was completed, I removed the hazard switch. Now, I could have used my tool if I just removed the mounting brackets for the stock radio, but instead of doing that, I just used a screwdriver to remove it. I do also end up removing those brackets, thinking I could use them for the new radio to, mount it to the car. I find out later that that actually is not the case, and that is something I will talk about in a little bit. Once I removed everything from the stock unit, I now, of course, started transferring it over to the new unit. I find out later that you're not supposed to tighten fully the hazard switch because it does start getting stuck if you fully tighten it. You want to just tighten it up to the point where it's right at the fully tightened point to give it enough play so that way when you push it in, it doesn't actually get stuck. I learned that, of course, later on. After transferring over the hazard switch, I then also transfer over the vents. With the vents, I was a little concerned that they weren't going to sit very well in this new bezel because the clips, the retaining clips for the vents that are on this new bezel aren't as good and they don't clip as good on the vents themselves. So I thought this was going to keep it too loose and it'll start rattling. It'll start rattling and also potentially separating from the bezel over time. However, once I installed the screws for them, I realized that concern was irrelevant because the screws hold this very well into the bezels, so nothing to worry there. Also, I decided on utilizing a screwdriver instead of an impact driver to install all the screws because these plastics, they can be fragile, and I could strip out the hole where essentially it makes the screw irrelevant. So to prevent that from happening, I end up using a screwdriver and doing it by hand instead of using an impact driver. Once done transferring everything over, it was time to connect the provided harness
to the stock harness. Overall, this is pretty easy. Everything connects to what it's supposed to connect to. There's not one connector that might connect to another one. Everything has its own destination. The only thing I was confused about, normally with all other head units that I have installed, the wiring harness that I buy uses all the connections in the stock wiring. This time around, this particular wiring harness did not connect one item to it. It actually left it hanging, and there was one spot where I thought it could connect, but it clearly was not able to connect. It was not the same connection. I had to communicate this with my contact at the company, and they said there are instances where not all the connections from the stock harness will connect to the provided harness, and that appears to be the case for me. Once I completed connecting all the connections to the supplied harness, I then cleaned up the windshield on the passenger side, upper right corner, so I can mount the GPS antenna. I just used a cleaner that you can get at any store just to make sure it's as clean as possible. And then I routed the wire on the pillar down to the side of the sealant or behind the sealant, and then underneath the dash by the glove compartment towards the radio. The nice thing about the sealant is it does cover up all the wires, so basically you can't tell that it's back there. Now, some people will say the way I hid the wire behind the pillar could be dangerous because of the airbag. If it ever deploys, it could cause that wiring to create problems with deployment. So if you're using this video for reference, I would say make sure you do your research. Again, I'm not a professional, just somebody who enjoys working on their cars and making modifications. It was easy to route underneath once I took off the cover. The cover is just a clip-in cover that you pull down, just like I've done with a lot of the other trims that I've removed so far in this video. Luckily, there is enough tightness underneath this cover where zip ties are not needed to hold the wire in place. And then essentially I had to reach in from the top to grab that wire and pull it up to where the radio is going to sit. I also attached the Wi-Fi antenna to the radio. I do like that it's a small antenna that just sits directly behind the radio and you don't have to mount it to anything else. That's very nice. And then once all that was done, I started connecting the supplied wiring harness to the actual radio, which again, very, very easy to do. Everything belongs where it's supposed to go. You can't actually connect something where it's not supposed to be. Now, there are supplied connections for the radio antenna. I just use the stock one, but there is one that you can also use that they supply, which I wasn't going to do. They also supply a SIM adapter that you could connect to the back of the radio if you want to run a SIM card for the 4G. It's not something I want to do, so I didn't care, so I left that out. And there was an additional RCA connection for if you needed more than what was already supplied. At the current moment, I left this out, but later down the road, I might add it just in case I add any additional components to the actual sound system. Now, before fully committing to this and popping everything back in place, I powered on the car just enough to see if the radio itself turns on and make sure that it actually works the way it's supposed to. And it did. Everything fired up exactly how it's supposed to with the reverse camera, as you can see, still working. After confirming that it is working, I forgot to connect the additional USB ports that were provided with the radio. You can connect the stock one to the radio along with these additional ones, which is fantastic. It's always nice to have a few extra connections for USB. What I did is I ended up, for now, just routing it here to the side where the glove compartment sits, and I made sure it wasn't in the way of the vents and just got that connected. For now, this is temporary. I don't have a nice way to like hide these ports or anything, so for now this is where it will be until I figure out a better way to do this. Again, this is another one of those things that plugs in where it's supposed to plug in. You can't mess it up. And also, as you see, I did have some leftover connections on the back of the radio. That's not a problem because this is for some items that I didn't connect, and maybe potentially one or two other items that might be additional things that you can get. As you can see, this is where I figured out leaving the hazard switch a little loose so it's not being pressed down by the dash trim from the climate control, allows it to be pushed in, turned on without any stuck feeling to it. And then it was just simply just making sure to put all the items removed back in to where they belong. Most of these are just clip-ins, and the radio is just clip-in as well. Now it's time to set up a few things on the radio. One of the things I needed to do was turn off the right mirror camera option. So essentially some of these cars have an option where if you turn on the right turn signal, there's a camera on the right mirror that lets you see what's over there. And so since my car doesn't have that feature, I need to turn that off. I simply went into settings, car settings, put in my code, which is 126, which is apparently for all the cars. Went to car bus and turned off the right view to hide, and then just hit apply and then exit. But when you exit, it will restart the radio, which is not a problem, but this is something that it will do every time you make an adjustment in the car settings. Now this radio has the option for wired and wireless Android Auto and wireless for Apple CarPlay. I use Android, so I was going to start out with the wired first because that usually helps the wireless work. When connecting my device to a wired connection, it wouldn't connect to Android Auto. It just stood on the screen and kept telling me that Z-Link was unavailable. That's the chip that it uses for connecting to Android Auto or CarPlay. The other issue I was having was when connecting to hotspot or my home Wi-Fi, when trying to update apps on the head unit or access the internet, for some reason it was acting like there was no internet. I mentioned this to my contact at the company and they said just do a factory reset and that should fix it. And it did. The factory reset's pretty easy. You just go into settings, you scroll all the way down, you go to system, you scroll more, you hit reset options, and then erase all data, and it says factory install or factory reset on it. Once that was done, everything was working fine. The other thing I didn't like that the radio was doing directly from the manufacturer was every time you put the car in reverse, it would turn off the radio and or go to a reverse screen with lines and an exclamation mark. And then also obviously your main display that comes with the car would show the reverse camera. This was annoying because I didn't want the radio to keep turning off. I just wanted the main display to have the camera. Luckily you can do this as well, and it is in the car settings. Again, you go to settings, car settings, put in the code 126 and go to other, and then where it says reverse detection, you want to disable. The other thing that was bothering me was not having dark mode on the radio right out of the box. It is on this really bright screen until you turn on the headlights, and then it goes into dark mode. This is easily adjustable by going into settings, go to car, go to extra settings, and then brightness mode is what you want to tap on. Change that over to dark, and you have dark mode even without the headlights being on, which is definitely a preferred thing for me. That was just a little demonstration on how high the volume goes. Now, obviously, listening to this over a video doesn't really work too well. I can say this is my one thing that I have I guess kind of a problem with, not necessarily for me, but maybe for audio heads who like to have even more of a system in these things, and that is essentially the sound doesn't seem to go as high as the stock unit. It limits the volume a number to 30, and it doesn't, I can say for sure that when I cranked up the stock head unit all the way up, it would sound like it wants to destroy the speakers because it's too loud. Outside of that, you are able to rearrange pretty much anything on the screen, which is fantastic, and that is definitely one of those customizations you want to see on an Android system, and it's why I do prefer an Android system when it comes to radios. As you also saw while you were listening, you could see that all the buttons on the actual steering wheel do work. So the volume control buttons work, and so do the changing of the display, the upper display, and of course modes on the actual radio, which is all welcome welcomed and great. That means that the wiring harness included is actually something that will allow you to use the car how pretty much was from the factory to be able to access as much of the settings as possible. And just to bring up a little bit more on the volume that I mentioned, even though the volume seems to be limited, there is a lot of options for adjustability when it comes to equalizers and amplifiers and all that. This is just a few effects that are already built in, but you do have an option where you can pretty much work with the customization to a very high level, way more than I would ever use, but maybe for the audio heads out there, they would definitely use it. And the biggest reason I love Android units for head units is because of this. I can run apps like the Track Addict and other apps that are useful, such as OBD2 dongle readings and stuff like that. And obviously accessing a whole bunch of apps from the Play Store that's available, and even the fact that you could run YouTube or any other video app. And of course with Track Addict, since I'm a track guy, I can literally run this app and keep, funny enough, track of my times on that track day.
Now, I did say that the volume was my one gripe, and I lied. There is one other concern that I have, and that is that the aftermarket unit doesn't use any kind of mounting solution except for the tabs to clip into the actual dash. It doesn't use the top stock one or the side mounts that the stock one has. And because, as you can see, even on this radio that's the stock one, the new unit just sits attached to the screen. And the way I'm seeing this is essentially when you go over bumps, harsh bumps, stuff like that, and maybe you don't see it and it's a pretty bad one, I feel like that's going to create strain here where the connection is. And over time, I feel like that strain will cause hardware issues where essentially, basically the screen stops working. That's the biggest one that I can assume would happen. But it is possible that, maybe other things will happen as well. Now, I did also mention this to my contact at the company, and they said that their engineers didn't see any problems with testing of something like this happening, which is great to hear. I just personally think the concern is there, but if their engineers who developed this didn't see this as a problem, or didn't, with their testing, didn't see it happen, then hey, that's great. I'm glad I'm wrong, but it was a concern that I had, and they did assure me that it wasn't a problem. If I can throw any kind of criticism at them, would be just try to figure out at least a top mounting solution. So it's pretty easy to do. It's right there at the top. You don't have to worry about getting the bottom bolts. Those were a pain. So if we can at least get this to where there's support from the top and from the clips that it connects to the dashboard, I think that would be ultimately the best solution.
But outside of that, I have no issues with this head unit. The display is very nice. It's a 10-inch display. It's QLED technology, which means it's just going to be perfect all around. And on top of that, it's smooth. It turns on really fast. Now you can mess with the setting on how fast you want it to turn on. Obviously, with it turning on fast, that means there is a little bit of a drain on the battery to maintain that speed, but you can adjust that if you want. That's not something I currently messed with, but we'll see down the road if that's something that bothers me. Everything is fast, quick, and easy to go through. Apps react fast. Literally, there is no lag, and you honestly can't beat that. There's even modern day cars with new head units from the factory that have lag issues. So to see a head unit like this from a third-party company that has no lag is fantastic. Honestly, there's really not much to say here. As of first impressions, I'm pleasantly surprised with all the features that this thing offers you. Plus the fact that so far I've experienced zero lag. I would almost want to give this a perfect rating. That's hard for me to do because I don't give anything a perfect rating. But as of right now, it would be very, very hard to say what would be the issues that I can think of. Outside of the ones that I've already mentioned, there really isn't anything else at the current moment, which is very impressive for a company. So do I recommend this? Absolutely. If you're interested in a head unit and you've been wanting to upgrade for quite some time, this is definitely a great option to get everything from one place. You don't have to worry about finding your wiring harness. You don't have to worry about finding the right head unit that you want. You don't have to worry about getting the bezel. It's all in one package. For that alone, I definitely recommend it. And then also the fact that it actually works really good would be the reason that I would definitely definitely recommend this. Now that's it for this video. I hope it helped. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure to stay tuned because we definitely got a bunch more Honda Accord performance parts coming up. I did promise you the front sway bar, and that is coming. And that will be the next video, I guarantee it. And we got plenty more after that. And of course, for this head unit, you know me, I will definitely talk about it again. I'm going to give it about 6 months or so, see how it goes through the winter here in Illinois and goes through a little bit of heat, and just see how it holds up. And then of course I'll give you my thoughts then. And again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.